Here is a number, $93,000. That is, roughly, the median household income in the United States. Two people working, maybe a third job between them, a mortgage, two cars, a retirement account they try not to look at too often. That is the American middle. That is most people's entire story. Now here's another number, $36 billion. That is approximately what Elon Musk made in a single day in November 2021. Not a year, not a career, one day. And here's the thing, that did not make headlines for long. We read it, we mildly lost our minds for about 45 seconds, and then we went back to arguing about parking spots and grocery prices. Because we have become so accustomed to numbers that size that they have stopped feeling real. They stopped landing. They bounce off us now like we have some kind of wealth shock absorber built in. But what if we are wrong to let them bounce? What if the reason we cannot feel those numbers is precisely the mechanism that makes the whole system so durable? This video is not going to tell you the rich are evil. That is lazy. It is also not going to tell you that anyone can make it with enough hustle. That is lazier. What it is going to do is show you exactly how the top 1% of Americans actually build, protect, and compound their wealth, the real machinery underneath the surface, and why the gap between them and everyone else is not just growing, it is structurally designed to grow. Stay with me, because the math is stranger than you think. Let us set the stage. The top 1% in America is not some vague, villainous abstraction. It is a specific threshold. In 2024, to crack the top 1% of individual earners, you need to bring in roughly $650,000 a year or more. For households, some estimates put it slightly higher, depending on the source and the state. That sounds like a lot, because it is. But here is where it immediately gets interesting. Income and wealth are not the same thing. And that distinction, that single gap between those two words, is where most people's understanding of inequality completely falls apart. You can earn $650,000 a year and still be, in the grand financial scheme of things, relatively fragile. A few bad years, a business failure, a medical catastrophe. Gone. The real top 1%, the people who are structurally insulated from normal economic gravity, are not primarily income earners. They are wealth holders. And wealth, unlike income, compounds, silently, automatically, often without them lifting a finger. In 2023, the top 1% of Americans owned roughly 31% of all household wealth in the country. The bottom 50%, that is 160 million people, owned about 2.5%. Read that again slowly. Half the country, 2.5%. And the gap is not stable. It has been widening consistently for decades. The question is why, and more importantly, how? To understand the top 1%, you have to understand one concept that they have mastered and that most people have not even been properly introduced to. Unrealized gains. Here is what that means in plain language. Imagine you own a painting. You paid $10,000 for it 20 years ago. Today, it is worth $2 million. You have not sold it. You have not received a single dollar. But on paper, you were $1.99 million richer than you were. Now imagine that instead of a painting, it is stock in a company, or real estate, or private equity, or a portfolio of assets that collectively appreciate year over year. You do not sell. You do not pay taxes on the gains. The wealth just accumulates, sitting there, growing, completely legally. This is how the wealthiest Americans hold the bulk of their net worth, not in income, in assets. And because those assets have not been sold, they have not been taxed. Jeff Bezos, in certain years, has paid a lower effective federal income tax rate than many nurses. This is not a conspiracy theory. ProPublica reported on it in 2021 using actual IRS data. The mechanism is simple. He does not need to sell stock to live. he borrows against it. This is called the buy, borrow, die strategy, and it is one of the most elegant financial maneuvers in the modern tax code. Here's how it works. Step 1. You accumulate assets, stocks, real estate, stakes in companies. These appreciate over time. Step 2. Instead of selling those assets and triggering a taxable event, you borrow money from a bank using your assets as collateral. Loans are not income, they are not taxed. Step 3. You live on the loan. You fund your lifestyle, your investments, your operations entirely through borrowed capital. Step 4. You die. And here is where it gets almost poetic in its absurdity. Under current U.S. tax law, when you pass your assets to your heirs, those assets receive what is called a stepped-up basis, meaning the IRS essentially resets the clock. All of those decades of unrealized gains, legally for tax purposes, vanish. Your heirs inherit the assets at their current value, not the original purchase price. The accumulated gain that was never taxed during your lifetime is simply gone from the books. This is not a loophole, it is not a glitch, it is a feature. And it has been in the tax code in various forms for over a century. Now let's talk about compounding, because this is where the gap between the wealthy and everyone else stops being a matter of discipline or even luck and starts being a matter of physics. The standard compound interest story goes like this. If you invest $1,000 at 7% annually, in 40 years you have roughly $15,000. Congratulations, time in the market, etc. That story is true and completely inadequate for explaining what happens at the top. When you have $10 million invested, a 7% return gives you $700,000 in a year. That's more than the average American earns in a decade. And you didn't work for it. You didn't even make a decision. The market just moved. Now you have $10.7 million. Next year, 7% of that is $749,000. You're pulling further ahead, not through effort, but through mass. Economists have a term for this. Capital begets capital. It's almost gravitational. Above a certain threshold of wealth, the asset itself becomes the engine. The person becomes almost incidental. And this is before we factor in access. The ultra-wealthy do not invest in the same markets you invest in. They have access to private equity, hedge funds, venture capital, real estate syndications, asset classes that have historically produced higher returns than public markets, and that require minimum investments of $1, $5, $10 million just to get in the door. The S&P 500 returned roughly 10% annually over the last century. Certain top-tier private equity funds have returned 20, 25%. Not every year, but over time, that difference is not a gap, it is a chasm. And the chasm widens every single year. Here is where we have to pause and address the story we tell ourselves. Because in America, the narrative about wealth is still, remarkably, built around individual genius and grit. The self-made billionaire, the dropout founder, the garage startup that became a trillion-dollar company. These stories are real. They also describe maybe 200 people on the planet. For the overwhelming majority of the top 1%, the path looks considerably less cinematic. Studies consistently show that the single strongest predictor of ending up in the top income bracket is having parents who were already in it. A child born into the top 1% has roughly a 1 in 3 chance of staying there as an adult. A child born into the bottom 20% has roughly a 1 in 20 chance of ever reaching the top quintile, let alone the top 1%. That is not a meritocracy. That is a relay race where some runners start halfway to the finish line and are handed the baton while still in the womb. And this is not just about inheritance in the obvious trust fund sense. It is about compounding advantages. private schools that cost more annually than most people earn, social networks that open doors before the first resume is ever written, the psychological confidence that comes from growing up in a household where financial risk feels manageable, the ability to take an unpaid internship at 22 because your parents cover rent. None of this is illegal. Very little of it is even visible from the outside, but it functions as infrastructure, private infrastructure, and it is incredibly durable. So here is where we zoom out. This is not just a story about rich people staying rich. It is a story about what happens to a society when capital accumulates at one end faster than it distributes at the other. In 1978, a CEO of a major U.S. corporation earned roughly 30 times what the median worker at that company made. By 2022, that ratio had grown to somewhere between 300 and 400 to 1, depending on the company and the methodology. Let that image settle. The same job, the same title, the same corner office. 40 decades later, the gap between that person and their average employee has grown by a factor of 10. Meanwhile, the purchasing power of the federal minimum wage, adjusted for inflation, is lower today than it was in 1968. 1968. We are not describing stagnation. We are describing a divergence. A slow, steady, structurally enforced pulling apart of two economic realities that are technically sharing the same country. And what makes it truly durable, what makes it uniquely hard to reverse, is that the wealthy are not just richer, they are more politically influential, more legally sophisticated, more capable of lobbying for the maintenance of the exact tax structures, capital gains rates, and estate provisions that protect their position. In 2021, the wealthiest Americans spent more on tax planning, lobbying, and legal strategy than the IRS had in its entire enforcement budget. The IRS, for a period, was auditing the working poor at roughly the same rate as the ultra-wealthy, because automated systems flag small discrepancies in the earned income tax credit faster than they can untangle the complex offshore structures of a family office. That is not incompetence. That is just how systems evolve when power is concentrated enough to shape the rules. Now, here's the part where I am supposed to tell you what to do about it. Invest early, diversify, build assets, not just income, vote thoughtfully, support policies you believe in. All of that is true. All of that is also the answer to a different question. The question I keep coming back to is this: at what point does inequality stop being an economic condition and start being an institutional one? Because there is a version of inequality that is uncomfortable but functional. Differential rewards for differential effort and risk. Fine, most people can accept that. But there is another version, the version described by the buy, borrow, die strategy, by the stepped-up basis, by the private equity returns unavailable to anyone without 8 figures in investable assets, where the rules of the game are genuinely different depending on where you start. Not harder, different. And in that version, the question is not whether you are working hard enough. The question is whether you are playing the same game at all. The top 1% is not a secret society. It is not hiding. It is operating entirely in the open, using legal tools, publicly available structures, and decades of accumulated policy influence in plain sight. What is unusual is not the wealth. What is unusual is the architecture beneath it. The invisible scaffolding of tax code provisions, asset class access, intergenerational compounding, and political leverage that makes that wealth not just large, but self-perpetuating. And perhaps the most unsettling truth of all is this: the people inside that system did not design it. They inherited it, they refined it, and now they pass it on, just like everything else. The question worth sitting with, the one I do not think anyone has fully answered, is whether a democracy can sustain itself indefinitely when the economic rules quietly diverge based on the zip code you were born in. Maybe it can. Or maybe we are already watching the answer unfold.